Jaroslav Martinic of Martinic felt hands seize his collar, and then the floor disappeared beneath him. 70 feet of empty air opened up as he tumbled through the window of the Bohemian chancellery, arms flailing uselessly at nothing, the cobblestones of Prague Castle's courtyard rushing upward with sickening speed. Behind him, Wilhelm Slavata followed, his screams swallowed by wind and Protestant rage. Their secretary, Philip Fabricius, came last, thrown like an afterthought, his papers scattering into the May morning like confused white birds. The fall took perhaps 3 seconds. In those seconds, the deadliest war in European history until 1914 became inevitable. But Martinic didn't die. None of them did. They crashed into something soft and reeking at the base of the castle wall, groaned, staggered to their feet covered in filth, and stumbled away while their attackers stared down in disbelief from the shattered window above. Catholics immediately declared it divine intervention, proof that God protected his faithful servants. Protestants insisted they'd landed in a massive pile of castle refuse and horse manure accumulated over decades beneath that particular window. Within weeks, both versions were hardening into theological artillery that would outlast the men who created them. This was May 23, 1618. By the time Europe stopped killing itself over the question, 8 million people would be dead. The story starts 9 years earlier, when Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II signed a document he never intended to honor. Rudolf ruled from Prague but barely ruled at all by 1609. His mind had begun its slow collapse into paranoia and occult obsession, and his younger brother Matthias was already maneuvering to replace him. Caught between sibling rivalry and the religious powder keg of Bohemia, where Protestants outnumbered Catholics perhaps 3 to 1, Rudolf made a desperate gamble for Protestant support. On July 9, 1609, he issued the Letter of Majesty, guaranteeing religious freedom to all Bohemian estates and allowing Protestant communities to build churches on royal land. The Protestants celebrated. They built their churches. They thought they'd won. Rudolf died in 1612, still muttering about alchemy and the apocalypse. Matthias took the throne and immediately began the work of forgetting his brother's promises. He was old, childless, and knew he'd be succeeded by his cousin Ferdinand of Styria, a man whose commitment to Catholicism made the Spanish Inquisition look indecisive. Ferdinand had already purged Protestantism from his own territories with methodical brutality, giving Lutheran nobles a simple choice: convert or leave. Thousands left. Ferdinand didn't blink. Matthias named Ferdinand King of Bohemia in 1617, a succession that technically required the consent of the Bohemian estates, but received it anyway through a mixture of pressure and promises nobody believed. The Hungarian estates had already accepted Ferdinand. The Austrian estates had caved. Bohemia was being encircled by a man who viewed religious tolerance as strategic weakness. The test came fast. In 1617, Protestant communities in the towns of Brumov and Hrob attempted to build churches on land they considered royal territory, protected under the Letter of Majesty. The royal governors argued the land belonged to Catholic institutions and ordered construction stopped. When the Protestants refused, troops arrived. At Hrob, soldiers tore down the half-built church while worshippers watched. At Brumov, they locked the doors and forbade Protestant services, stationing guards to enforce the ban. Count Jindřich Matthias Thurn understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about 2 churches in obscure towns. This was Ferdinand establishing precedent, testing how much violation the Protestants would swallow before they choked. Every day they accepted this became evidence of their weakness. Every legalistic appeal to the Letter of Majesty's fine print demonstrated that they still believed in a system that no longer believed in them. Thurn was a soldier who'd fought against the Ottoman Turks and knew what happened when you let an enemy establish momentum. In March 1618, he called for an assembly of Protestant estates in Prague. Officially, they were meeting to discuss the church closures. Actually, they were deciding whether to start a war. The assembly convened in the Carolinum, Prague's ancient university, and immediately split between those who wanted to petition Matthias for redress, and those who understood petitions were suicide notes written politely. The moderates argued that Ferdinand wasn't emperor yet, that Matthias might intervene, that negotiations still had room to work. The radicals countered that Matthias was dying and Ferdinand would inherit an empire, that waiting meant fighting an emperor instead of a king, that the time to resist was before your enemy consolidated absolute power. The debate consumed weeks. Then someone suggested they confront the royal governors directly. Jaroslav Martinic of Martinic and Wilhelm Slavata weren't random bureaucrats. They were the architects of the church closures, Catholic zealots who'd celebrated every Protestant humiliation, men who represented everything the estates had learned to fear about Ferdinand's eventual rule. If they could be intimidated into reversing course, perhaps broader conflict could be avoided. If intimidation failed, at least everyone would know where they stood. On the morning of May 23rd, a crowd of Protestant nobles and their armed supporters marched up the hill to Prague Castle. They weren't hiding their intentions anymore. Thurn led them carrying a document of grievances that read more like an indictment. The castle's guards didn't stop them because nobody had ordered the guards to stop them. This was still technically a legal assembly of Bohemian estates, exercising their constitutional rights, right up until the moment it became something else entirely. They climbed the stairs to the Bohemian chancellery in the castle's Ludwig wing. Martinic and Slavata looked up from their administrative papers to find their office flooding with angry armed men who'd stopped pretending this was about paperwork. Thurn didn't waste time on preambles. He produced his list of grievances and demanded the governors take responsibility for violating the letter of majesty. Martinic responded with the legal argument that the land in question wasn't technically royal land and therefore the letter didn't apply. Slavata added that the governors served the king, not the estates, and owed them no explanation for executing royal policy. These were the wrong answers. Perhaps no right answer existed by that point, but condescension and legalism were spectacularly wrong. The room's temperature changed. Someone shouted that these men were enemies of the kingdom. Others took up the cry. Martinic and Slavata backed toward the tall eastern windows as the mob closed in, still apparently believing their royal appointments made them untouchable. Hands grabbed Martinic first and dragged him to the window. He fought, but aristocrats who spend their days shuffling papers don't fight effectively against men who've trained for war. Someone yanked the window open. Cold air rushed into the stuffy office. Martinic got one last look at Thurn's face, trying to read whether this was theater meant to terrify or genuine intent to kill, and then they lifted him and threw him out. Slavata tried to hold onto the window frame as they grabbed him. His fingers scraped the stone, found no purchase, and he followed Martinic into the void. Philip Fabricius committed the fatal error of loyalty. Instead of running, he tried to help his masters, which meant the Protestants threw him out too, because why leave witnesses to describe how far they'd gone? 3 men fell 70 feet. 3 men lived. They crashed into whatever was at the base of that wall, groaned, staggered upright, covered in filth that might have been their salvation or might have been irrelevant to divine protection depending on which version you needed to believe, and stumbled away while their attackers stared down in shock. The defenestration itself was deliberately archaic, chosen for its historical resonance. In 1419, Hussite rebels had defenestrated 7 Catholic city councillors, killing them all and triggering the Hussite wars that devastated Bohemia for decades. The Protestant nobles in 1618 invoked that memory consciously. They were connecting their struggle to Jan Hus, the Czech reformer burned at the stake in 1415, reminding everyone that Bohemia had resisted Catholic overreach before. But the parallel was ominous. The Hussites had won battles and lost wars, had seen their country ravaged, had discovered that religious resistance without overwhelming military superiority just meant slower defeat. Martinic and Slavata fled Prague within hours, heading straight for Vienna to report the outrage to Matthias and Ferdinand. Their clothes still reeked. Their dignity was shattered more thoroughly than their bones, but they were alive to testify, to transform their humiliation into Catholic martyrdom, to give Ferdinand exactly the justification he'd always wanted for the crackdown he'd always planned. The Catholic story calcified within days. The Virgin Mary herself had appeared beneath the falling men, spreading her cloak to catch them softly. Angels had slowed their descent. Priests preached the miracle from pulpits across Catholic Europe, and each retelling made the divine intervention more explicit, more impossible to explain naturally, more proof that the Protestants had defied heaven itself and lost. Protestant pamphleteers countered with scatological humor. No miracle had occurred, just dumb luck and decades of accumulated garbage beneath a castle window. Some got creative, suggesting that Martinic and Slavata had been so full of excrement that they simply bounced when they hit more of the same substance. The mockery was tactical. If Catholics claimed God saved these men, Protestants needed to make that claim seem ridiculous, to frame Catholic miracles as desperate propaganda rather than genuine divine intervention. But Europe didn't go to war over garbage versus grace. It went to war because the Bohemian Protestant estates had physically attacked representatives of royal authority, had declared through violent action that they no longer accepted Ferdinand's right to rule them, had transformed a religious dispute into open rebellion that demanded response. The Bohemian estates moved quickly to consolidate their position. They established a provisional government of 30 directors, expelled Jesuits from Prague, began raising an army. In August 1619, they formally declared Ferdinand deposed and elected Frederick IV of the Palatinate as their new king. Frederick was young, married to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of England's King James I, and catastrophically inexperienced in the realities of imperial politics. He accepted the crown believing God wanted him to defend Protestantism. His wife believed they were embarking on a romantic adventure. Neither understood they were walking into a trap. Frederick arrived in Prague in October 1619 for his coronation and immediately began alienating the population he'd come to rule. His Calvinist theologians stripped Catholic decorations from churches with zealous enthusiasm, offending not just Catholics, but also Lutherans and Utraquists, who'd worshipped alongside those images for generations. He replaced traditional Czech ceremonies with reformed Protestant rituals that felt foreign and imposed. His court spoke German, while most Bohemians spoke Czech. Within weeks, the romantic adventure was revealing itself as occupation by well-meaning but culturally tone-deaf foreigners. Meanwhile, Ferdinand had been elected Holy Roman Emperor in August 1619, despite the Bohemian Rebellion, or perhaps because of it. The 7 imperial electors saw the defenestration and subsequent deposition as an attack on legitimate authority that threatened their own positions. If Bohemian estates could simply throw out a king they disliked, what stopped other estates from doing the same? The election gave Ferdinand resources and legitimacy that Frederick's Bohemian crown couldn't match. Ferdinand assembled his armies with methodical patience. He secured Spanish support through family connections. He negotiated with Maximilian of Bavaria, offering him Frederick's title as Elector Palatine and chunks of Frederick's territory in exchange for military assistance. He built an alliance of Catholic princes who feared Protestant expansion more than they disliked Habsburg power. The Lutheran princes of Germany, who should have been Bohemia's natural allies, mostly stayed neutral. Some disliked Frederick's Calvinism more than they feared Ferdinand's Catholicism. Others worried about challenging imperial authority. All of them miscalculated how devastating Ferdinand's victory would be for German Protestantism generally. The armies met at White Mountain, just outside Prague on November 8, 1620. The battle lasted perhaps 2 hours. The Bohemian forces, poorly led by commanders who'd never fought together and soldiers who didn't trust their foreign king, broke almost immediately when Catholic cavalry under Johann Cercles, Count of Tilly, charged their flank. Frederick watched from a nearby hill as his army disintegrated. He fled that night, so quickly that his enemies mockingly called him the Winter King, having reigned for just one winter. Elizabeth escaped with him, pregnant and terrified, abandoning the romantic adventure for permanent exile that would last until her death in 1662. Ferdinand's revenge was comprehensive and calculated. He didn't just defeat the rebellion, he erased it. On June 21, 1621, 27 Bohemian rebel leaders were executed in Prague's Old Town Square in a carefully choreographed spectacle of imperial justice. Some were beheaded quickly, others were hanged slowly, some were quartered, their body parts displayed at city gates. The executioners worked from morning until evening while crowds watched. The heads of 12 leaders were mounted on the Charles Bridge, still visible years later as warning and testament. The executions were just the beginning. Ferdinand confiscated Protestant estates wholesale, seizing roughly half of all noble land in Bohemia and redistributing it to Catholic loyalists in the largest property transfer in the kingdom's history. Families that had held land for centuries found themselves dispossessed overnight. The new Catholic nobility that replaced them were often foreigners, Germans and Spaniards and Italians, men whose loyalty to Ferdinand was absolute because their wealth depended entirely on his continued favor. Ferdinand revoked the Letter of Majesty formally in 1627, making Catholicism Bohemia's only legal religion. Protestant nobles faced a simple choice: convert or leave. Protestant commoners faced a harsher choice: convert or face persecution that could include property seizure, imprisonment, or execution for heresy. Roughly 36,000 Protestant families fled Bohemia between 1620 and 1640, taking their skills and wealth to Protestant territories in Germany, Poland, and the Netherlands. Those who stayed and refused conversion went underground, practicing their faith in secret for generations. But Ferdinand's total victory in Bohemia didn't end the war. It expanded it by demonstrating what Catholic victory looked like in practice. Frederick's dispossession gave Protestant princes throughout the empire a concrete example of what would happen if they lost. The complete elimination of Protestantism from Bohemia showed that Ferdinand's promises of limited religious tolerance were worthless. Every Protestant prince in Germany looked at Bohemia and saw their own potential future. The war metastasized. Christian IV of Denmark intervened in 1625, partly from religious solidarity, partly because Danish control of northern German bishoprics was threatened by Catholic expansion. His armies were crushed by Tilly and the ruthless mercenary commander Albrecht von Wallenstein, who financed his forces by systematically plundering every territory they passed through. Wallenstein understood that armies could be self-funding if you abandoned any pretense of limiting civilian suffering. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden entered the war in 1630, bringing professional soldiers and tactical innovations that finally gave Protestants military parity with Catholic forces. He won stunning victories at Breitenfeld and Lutzen, but died in the latter battle in 1632, leaving Swedish forces without his strategic genius. His death didn't end Swedish involvement. It just meant Swedish generals fought for territorial gain rather than religious principle, prolonging the war by removing any coherent goal beyond continued plunder. France entered in 1635, Catholic France backing Protestant powers because Cardinal Richelieu understood that Habsburg Spain and Habsburg Austria surrounding France was a bigger threat than Protestant heresy. This was the final transformation of the conflict from religious war to pure power politics. By the 1640s, nobody was fighting about church doctrine anymore. They were fighting because armies needed to keep fighting to justify their existence, because military contractors had too much invested in continued war, because negotiating peace was harder than continuing violence. The German territories suffered devastation beyond anything Europe had experienced since the Black Death. Armies lived off the land, which meant systematic plundering of villages and towns. Soldiers took food, livestock, valuables, anything that could feed them or be sold. Villages that couldn't provide were burned. Villagers who resisted were killed. Disease followed the armies, spreading typhus and plague through populations already weakened by starvation. Some regions of Germany lost half their population. The city of Magdeburg was sacked so thoroughly by Tilly's forces in 1631 that perhaps 20,000 of its 25,000 inhabitants died, and its name became synonymous with total destruction. The Peace of Westphalia finally ended the war in 1648 through two simultaneous treaties negotiated in Munster and Osnabrück. The agreements established the principle of cuius regio, eius religio. Rulers determined their territories' religions. The empire's religious balance was frozen at 1624 levels, before Swedish intervention. Calvinism was finally recognized as legitimate alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism. These provisions solved nothing philosophically but acknowledged that religious uniformity in the empire was impossible, that attempts to enforce it meant perpetual war, that coexistence through separation was preferable to coexistence through conversion. The treaties also dismantled any remaining pretense of imperial unity. German princes gained near-sovereign control over their territories. Sweden gained territory along the Baltic coast. France gained territories in Alsace. The Holy Roman Empire survived in name, but ceased to function as a meaningful political entity. Ferdinand III, who'd succeeded his father Ferdinand II in 1637, signed away most of the imperial authority that the Defenestration had been meant to defend. Martinic survived the war, dying peacefully in 1649 with his lands and titles intact. Slavata lived until 1652. Both men received estates confiscated from Protestant nobles as reward for their suffering. Both watched Bohemia transform into a Catholic stronghold, where their grandchildren would worship without fear. Whether they considered the cost worth the outcome remains unknown. Thurn fled after White Mountain and spent years wandering Europe trying to restart Protestant resistance. He served in Swedish armies, fought in campaigns across Germany, watched the war he'd started consume everything he'd fought to protect. In 1639, he reconciled with Ferdinand III, converted to Catholicism, and died the following year. His conversion suggests either profound disillusionment or profound pragmatism. Possibly both. Possibly he'd simply run out of alternatives and decided survival through apostasy beat martyrdom for a cause that had already lost. The window itself still exists in Prague Castle, though the room behind it has been rebuilt multiple times. Tour guides pointed out to visitors who take photos and make jokes about defenestration being the most Czech form of political protest. The morbid humor obscures what that window represents. The exact point where symbolic violence escaped control, where an act meant to demonstrate strength revealed desperate weakness, where 3 seconds of falling created consequences that lasted 30 years. The psychology of the act reveals its fatal flaw. Throwing someone out a window requires being close enough to grab them, strong enough to lift them, committed enough to push through their resistance. It's not firing a musket from distance or issuing an order that someone else executes. It's hands-on violence that makes negotiation impossible afterward. You can negotiate with someone who threatens you from across a room. You cannot negotiate with someone who has already tried to kill you with their own hands, regardless of whether the attempt succeeded. The 3 seconds of falling contained multitudes. In those seconds, the Protestant nobles upstairs transitioned from subjects petitioning for rights to rebels who'd attacked royal authority. In those seconds, every moderate position in the empire dissolved, because moderation means believing both sides will eventually compromise. And you cannot compromise about whether throwing the emperor's governors out of windows is acceptable political discourse. Ferdinand could no longer pretend to tolerate Protestantism after his officials had been defenestrated for enforcing his will. The Protestants could no longer pretend Ferdinand would honor their rights after demonstrating through violence that they expected no justice through legal channels. Everyone was trapped by the logic of escalation they'd created together. Each side's worst fears about the other were confirmed. Each side's most aggressive factions gained control. Each side had to prove it couldn't be pushed around, which meant pushing harder, which meant the shoving match became a brawl, became a massacre, became 8 million dead. The defenestration worked exactly as intended in demonstrating Protestant resolve and exactly opposite to its intended effect in securing Protestant rights. This is the pattern of revolutionary violence. It communicates perfectly and accomplishes poorly, sends a message that gets received one as a declaration of war, tries to intimidate and instead eliminates the middle ground where intimidation might have succeeded. Thurn and his fellow conspirators chose the most dramatic possible form of resistance at the worst possible moment. They attacked before they'd built sufficient alliances, before they'd secured adequate military resources, before they'd prepared for the total war their gesture invited. The drama made negotiation impossible while making military defeat inevitable. They gambled that Protestant princes across Germany would rally to Bohemia's defense. They gambled that Ferdinand's election as emperor could be blocked. They gambled that military intervention would be swift and successful. They lost every bet. The window is just a window now, in a castle that hosts tourists and government ceremonies. The courtyard below is paved and clean. No garbage piles accumulate beneath historical sites anymore, but the distance remains. 70 feet of empty air between the window and the ground, between symbolic gesture and total war, between 3 men falling and 8 million dying, between the moment when violence still seemed like a solution and the decades when everyone learned exactly what that solution cost.